The rain had stopped an hour before the service, leaving the church grounds slick and gray. Bradley Connor stood at the edge of the crowd, watching his wife, Leona, greet mourners with a practiced grace she'd inherited from her grandmother. Mary Ann Keeley had been 93 when she passed, and half of Sterling Heights had turned out to pay respects to a woman who'd spent decades running the town's only independent bookstore. Bradley adjusted his tie and scanned the gathering. His son Ethan, 9 years old and uncomfortable in his black suit, stood near the church entrance, fidgeting with something in his pocket. Bradley caught his eye and gave him a reassuring nod. The boy had been close to his great-grandmother, and the loss had hit him harder than Bradley had anticipated. "There you are." Leona appeared at his elbow, her red-rimmed eyes barely contained behind oversized sunglasses. "People are asking about you." "I'm here," Bradley said quietly. "Just giving you space." She squeezed his arm, a gesture that would have meant something 3 years ago. Now, it felt performative, another piece of the facade they maintained for outsiders. Their marriage had become a cold arrangement since Leona's promotion at the law firm. Since the long hours turned into overnight stays at the office, since Bradley had stopped pretending he didn't notice the distance growing between them. "Lloyd's looking for Ethan. Leona said he wants to give him something from Grandma Mary Ann." Bradley's jaw tightened at the mention of his brother-in-law. Lloyd Keeley was 42, perpetually unemployed, and had been living in Mary Ann's basement for the past decade. He had a way of ingratiating himself with family members while draining them dry, always with a sob story about bad luck or unfair circumstances. Bradley had seen through him from the beginning, but Leona defended her younger brother with a fierce loyalty that bordered on willful blindness. "I'll find them," Bradley said. He'd been a forensic psychologist for 15 years, specializing in criminal behavior analysis. He'd interviewed serial killers, con artists, and predators of every variety. He knew the signs, the charm that felt slightly off, the way Lloyd's eyes never quite matched his smile, the careful monitoring of others' reactions to calibrate his own responses. Bradley had tried to explain it to Leona once, 3 years ago, but she'd accused him of being paranoid and jealous of her family bonds. After that, Bradley had stopped talking and started watching. He documented everything in a leather journal he kept locked in his office. The way Lloyd always found reasons to be alone with Ethan. The inappropriate jokes disguised as playfulness. The gifts that seemed calculated to create a sense of obligation. The times Bradley had caught Lloyd staring at his son with an expression that made his blood run cold. 6 months ago, Bradley had taken steps. He bought a small recording device barely larger than a USB drive and taught Ethan how to activate it with a double press of the button. He'd framed it as a spy game, something fun between father and son. But his real purpose was protection. He told Ethan to keep it in his pocket whenever Uncle Lloyd was around and press it if he ever felt uncomfortable. Now standing in the cemetery parking lot, Bradley felt the familiar weight of dread settle in his chest. He moved through the crowd, nodding at acquaintances, his eyes searching for Ethan's small frame. The reception was being held in the church basement, but many mourners lingered outside smoking and sharing memories. Bradley checked his phone. A text from his colleague Rick Wood asking about a case consultation. He ignored it and kept moving. Then he saw them. Lloyd had Ethan by the shoulder, guiding him around the corner of the church toward the old cemetery that sprawled behind the building. It was a historical site dating back to the 1800s with crumbling headstones and overgrown paths that nobody maintained anymore. Bradley had explored it as a kid when his own grandmother had dragged him to services. His instinct screamed. He followed, keeping a distance of about 30 yards, using the scattered groups of mourners as cover. Lloyd and Ethan disappeared behind the church, and Bradley quickened his pace. The old cemetery was quiet. Most people avoided it. The ground was uneven and there were rumors of sinkholes near the far wall. Bradley moved carefully, staying low behind a row of tall monuments. He could hear Lloyd's voice now. Honey smooth and coaxing. "Just want to show you something special, buddy. Your great-grandma wanted you to have it, but it's our secret. Okay, don't tell your dad." Bradley's hands clenched into fists. He crept closer, using an old mausoleum for cover. Through the gaps in the stone, he could see them now. Lloyd had Ethan backed against the cemetery's rear wall, one hand on the boy's shoulder, the other reaching toward his face. Ethan looked terrified, frozen in that particular way children freeze when an adult they're supposed to trust crosses a line they can't articulate. "Uncle Lloyd, I want to go back," Ethan said, his voice small. "In a minute, champ. Just let me." Bradley's training kicked in. He pulled out his phone, set it to video, and started recording. Every second of evidence mattered. Lloyd's hand moved to Ethan's collar, starting to unbutton his shirt. "No," Ethan said louder now. "Stop. Don't be difficult." Lloyd's voice had lost its friendly edge. "I'm trying to give you something nice. Don't you want to be a good boy?" Bradley had seen enough. He dialed 911, keeping his voice low and controlled as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. He gave the exact location, described what he was witnessing, requested immediate response. "Stay on the line, sir." The dispatcher said, "I'm going to intervene now," Bradley said. "My son is in immediate danger." He ended the call and stepped out from behind the mausoleum. Lloyd, his brother-in-law, spun around, his face cycling through surprise, anger, and then settling on a practiced innocence. Ethan broke free and ran to Bradley, who pulled him close without taking his eyes off Lloyd. "Bradley, hey man, I was just showing Ethan." "Don't." Bradley's voice was ice. "Don't say another word." Lloyd's expression shifted. "You got this all wrong. I was giving him Grandma's watch. And his shirt was. I saw everything. Police are on their way." The mask dropped completely. Lloyd's face twisted with rage. "You self-righteous piece of garbage. You've been waiting for this, haven't you? Trying to turn everyone against me. You did that yourself. Leona will never forgive you for this. Never. You're destroying this family over your paranoid delusions." Bradley heard sirens in the distance. "We'll let the evidence speak." Lloyd took a step forward and Bradley shifted Ethan behind him. "You think they'll believe you? I'm the grieving grandson at his grandmother's funeral. You're the jealous husband who's been making accusations for years. Leona told me how you tried to poison her against me." The sirens grew louder. Lloyd's eyes darted toward the sound, calculating. "Don't run," Bradley said. "It'll only make it worse. Forget you." Lloyd bolted toward the far wall, but his expensive funeral shoes slipped on the wet grass. He went down hard, scrambling to get up as two police cruisers pulled into the church parking lot. Bradley kept Ethan close as officers emerged from their vehicles. He raised his free hand to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm the one who called," he said to the approaching officer, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes. "That man there," he pointed at Lloyd, who was now standing against the wall, his suit grass-stained, "was attempting to assault my son." "That's a complete lie." Lloyd shouted, "Officer, this is a family matter. My brother-in-law is mentally unstable. He's been harassing me for years." The officer looked between them. "Everyone stay calm. We're going to sort this out." That's when Leona appeared, running from the church with several family members behind her. Her face was flushed with fury. "Bradley, what the heck are you doing? Protecting our son." She looked at Lloyd, then back at Bradley, and her expression hardened in a way he'd never seen before. "You called the police at my grandmother's funeral." "Leona," he was touching Ethan. "I saw you saw what you wanted to see." She was screaming now. All composure gone. "You've been trying to destroy Lloyd for years because you can't stand that I have family who actually cares about me." The officer stepped between them. "Ma'am, I need you to step back. This is insane." Leona's voice broke. "Bradley, you've made a grave mistake. You have no idea what you've done to this family." Bradley looked at his wife, this woman he'd once loved, and felt the last thread of their marriage snap. "You can't save him now, Leona." More officers had arrived. One was speaking with Lloyd, taking his statement. Another approached Bradley. "Sir, I'm going to need you to tell me exactly what you witnessed." Bradley recounted everything in careful detail while holding Ethan close. The boy was shaking and Bradley could feel his small heart racing. The officer taking Lloyd's statement called over to her colleague. "He says he was giving the boy a family heirloom and the father misinterpreted the situation." Leona grabbed onto this. See. You've traumatized our family over nothing. The lead officer looked at Bradley. Do you have any evidence of what you're claiming? I recorded part of it on my phone. Bradley said, pulling out the device. But that's not all. He knelt down in front of Ethan, putting his hands gently on his son's shoulders. Ethan, remember our special game? Do you have your spy gear? Ethan nodded, his eyes wide. With trembling fingers, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small recording device Bradley had given him. It was still running, the tiny red light blinking in the gray afternoon. What is that? Leona demanded. Bradley handed it to the officer. This is a voice-activated recorder I gave my son 6 months ago for his protection. If it was on, it captured everything that was said. The officer examined the device, then looked at Lloyd, whose face had gone pale. Is this really necessary? Leona said, but her voice had lost its certainty. Bradley, please, can't we handle this privately? No, Bradley said simply. Not anymore. The officer who'd been with Lloyd returned. Sir, I'm going to need you to come down to the station for questioning. This is harassment. Lloyd's voice pitched higher. I'm a victim here. You can cooperate voluntarily or we can do this another way. The officer said, her hand resting on her belt. Lloyd looked at Leona, desperation clear in his eyes. Sis, please tell them. Tell them I would never. But Leona was staring at the recording device in the officer's hand, and something in her expression was cracking. Bradley could see the moment doubt crept in. The first hairline fracture in her wall of denial. The Sterling Heights police station smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. Bradley sat in an interview room with Ethan while officers processed the evidence. Through the one-way glass, he could see the activity in the squad room. Lloyd being led to another interview room. Leona pacing by the front desk, her phone pressed to her ear. Detective Raymond Barber entered, a file folder under his arm. He was in his 50s with the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's dark side. Mr. Connor, I'm going to need to speak with your son alone, he said. We have a child forensic interviewer on the way. Bradley had expected this. In cases involving minors, separate interviews were standard protocol. He knelt in front of Ethan. You're going to talk to some nice people, and they're going to ask you about what happened today. Just tell them the truth, okay? Exactly what you remember. Ethan nodded, but his grip on Bradley's hand tightened. Will you be right outside? I'll be right here. I promise. A woman arrived 15 minutes later. Karen Morse, a specialist in child trauma. She had kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Ethan at ease. Bradley watched through the glass as she sat with his son, using dolls and drawings to help him communicate what Lloyd had done. Detective Barber joined Bradley at the window. The recording device. That was smart thinking. I'm a forensic psychologist, Bradley said. I work with law enforcement on criminal behavior analysis. I know how these things work. You suspected something before today. It wasn't a question. Bradley nodded. For 3 years, I kept detailed notes of every concerning interaction, every red flag. My wife thought I was paranoid. And today, I followed my instincts. Bradley watched Ethan point to the doll, showing where Lloyd had touched him. I should have acted sooner. You can't think like that, Barber said. You protected your kid. That's what matters. Through the window, Bradley could see Leona being led to another room. Her face was a mask of confusion and anger. She glanced toward where Bradley stood, and for a moment, their eyes met through the glass. Then she looked away. Your wife is claiming you have a vendetta against her brother. Barber says you've been trying to turn the family against him for years. That's accurate. Bradley kept his voice level. I have been trying to protect my son from a predator and my wife chose to believe her brother instead. We're going to need those notes you mentioned. I have everything documented. Times, dates, witnesses to certain behaviors. I also have Lloyd's employment history which shows a pattern of leaving positions under mysterious circumstances. I started building a file 2 years ago when my concerns intensified. Barber raised an eyebrow. You investigated your own brother-in-law. I analyzed publicly available information. It's not illegal. Bradley turned from the window. Detective, I've spent 15 years studying predators. Lloyd Keely fits the profile perfectly. The charm, the manipulation, the way he positions himself in positions of trust while maintaining plausible deniability. I couldn't prove anything concrete until today, but I knew. I've always known. Why not report your suspicions earlier? Because suspicions aren't evidence. Because I knew how it would look. Jealous husband trying to undermine his wife's family. Because I needed proof that would stand up in court. Bradley's hands clenched. And because I was terrified that if I moved too soon and failed, it would give him more access to my son. So, I watched, I documented, I prepared, and I made sure that when the moment came, I'd be ready. Barber studied him for a long moment. You're either the most paranoid person I've ever met or the smartest. I'm a father protecting his child. The interview with Ethan lasted an hour. When it ended, Karen Morse emerged with a grave expression. She spoke quietly with Detective Barber and Bradley watched the detective's face darken. Mr. Connor, Barber said, we're going to need to keep your son here a bit longer. The pediatric examination will take place at Sterling Memorial Hospital. We have a sane nurse who specializes in these cases. Bradley felt his stomach drop. He'd hoped it hadn't gone that far, but deep down he'd known. I understand. And we're arresting Lloyd Keely. The recording device captured enough to support charges of attempted child sexual assault, among other things. Good. There's something else. Barber glanced at his notes. Your son said this isn't the first time Lloyd tried something. He mentioned incidents over the past year that he was afraid to talk about because Lloyd told him it would upset his mother. The rage that flooded through Bradley was so intense he had to grip the edge of the table. That monster. We'll need detailed statements about those incidents. And Mr. Connor, Barber's voice softened slightly. You should prepare yourself. This is going to get worse before it gets better. The investigation will be thorough. Your family is going to be under a microscope. And your wife. My wife made her choice. At the hospital, Bradley held Ethan's hand while medical professionals performed their examination. The sane nurse was professional and kind, but Bradley could see the fury in her eyes when she emerged from the exam room. Your son is very brave, she told him. We found evidence consistent with inappropriate contact. I'll be providing a full report to the police. Bradley closed his eyes. He'd prevented the worst, but Lloyd had still hurt his child. The guilt crashed over him. Should he have acted sooner? Should he have forced the issue with Leona years ago? Dad. Ethan's small voice pulled him back. Can we go home now? Soon, buddy. Soon. They returned to the police station as the sun began to set. Leona was still there, but now she was in the company of a lawyer, Devin McGowan, a partner at her firm who specialized in criminal defense. Bradley recognized him from firm holiday parties. Leona intercepted them in the hallway. Bradley, we need to talk. Not now, please. Her voice cracked. I need to understand what's happening. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a woman teetering on the edge of breakdown. Her makeup was smeared, her hair disheveled, and there was a wild uncertainty in her eyes he'd never seen before. They're charging Lloyd, she said. They said, attempted sexual assault of a minor. They said Ethan gave a statement about other times, about things Lloyd did over the past year. She grabbed Bradley's arm. Tell me it's not true. Tell me you coached him to say these things. Bradley pulled his arm free. You need to hear yourself right now. You're accusing me of coaching our son to lie about being molested because you can't accept that your brother is a predator. He's my brother. And Ethan is your son. Bradley's voice echoed in the hallway. Your son Leona, your child who came to me 6 months ago crying because Uncle Lloyd touched him in a way that made him feel scared, and I had to convince him it wasn't his fault while you were working late again, probably at dinner with your colleagues, completely oblivious to what was happening in your own home. She stepped back as if he'd struck her. He never said anything to me because Lloyd told him it would make you sad because he knew you'd defend your brother over your own child's safety. Bradley's voice dropped to a lethal quiet. And he was right, wasn't he? Even now, with evidence, with testimony, with medical examination results, you're looking for a way to explain it away. I can't believe Lloyd would. Then don't. But stay away from Ethan until you figure out whose side you're on. He led his son past her and didn't look back. Detective Barber met them at the front desk. Lloyd's been formally charged. We're holding him overnight and there'll be an arraignment tomorrow morning. Given the nature of the charges and his lack of employment, we'll be requesting no bail. What about my notes? The documentation I mentioned. Bring everything to the station tomorrow. It'll support the prosecution's case for establishing a pattern of behavior. Bradley nodded. Ethan tugged at his sleeve. Dad, is Mom coming home? It was the question Bradley had been dreading. He knelt down to his son's level. I don't know, buddy. Things are complicated right now. Did I do something wrong? No. Bradley pulled him into a fierce hug. No, Ethan, you did everything right. You were so brave today. I'm so proud of you. They drove home in silence. Their house was a modest colonial on Maple Street with a tire swing Bradley had hung 2 summers ago and a garden Leona had planted but never maintained. It felt different now, contaminated somehow, knowing that Lloyd had been here, had been alone with Ethan in these rooms. Bradley ordered pizza and let Ethan watch cartoons while he sat at the kitchen table, his leather journal open in front of him. 3 years of observations, all leading to this moment. He documented the first concerning incident. Lloyd volunteering to babysit unprompted, then being found alone with Ethan in the bathroom helping him. He noted Lloyd's habit of giving Ethan gifts after spending time alone with him. Classic grooming behavior. He tracked the pattern of Lloyd's previous jobs, a youth soccer coach position he'd left suddenly, a brief stint at a daycare that ended without explanation. Bradley had called former employers, claiming to be checking references. The responses had been carefully worded, the kind of diplomatic non-answers that screamed liability concerns. One supervisor had been more forthcoming after Bradley explained he was a parent doing due diligence. Let's just say there were complaints, nothing we could prove, but enough that we thought it best if he moved on. That conversation had happened 18 months ago. Bradley had tried to tell Leona, but she'd accused him of being controlling and jealous. They'd had their worst fight that night, and she'd moved into the guest room for a week. After that, Bradley had changed tactics. He couldn't change Leona's mind. So, he focused on protecting Ethan, the recording device, teaching his son about boundaries and inappropriate touch, making sure he was never alone with Lloyd if Bradley could help it. But he couldn't be everywhere. And Lloyd was patient, waiting for the moments when Bradley's guard was down. His phone buzzed. Rick Wood, his colleague, calling again. Bradley, man, I heard what happened. Are you okay? I've been better. What do you need? Bradley appreciated that Rick didn't offer empty platitudes or ask if he was sure about what he'd seen. They'd worked together long enough for Rick to know Bradley didn't make accusations lightly. I need character witnesses, Bradley said. People who can testify that I'm not paranoid or vindictive. And I need someone to review my documentation, make sure it's solid enough for court. Send it over. I'll have it analyzed by morning. After they hung up, Bradley checked on Ethan. His son had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted by the trauma of the day. Bradley carried him upstairs, tucked him into bed, and sat in the chair by the window, watching over him. Around midnight, he heard a car in the driveway, Leona's Mercedes. He listened to the front door open, heard her footsteps on the stairs. She appeared in Ethan's doorway, her face haggard. I want to see him, she whispered. You can look. Don't wake him. She moved to the bedside, staring down at their sleeping son. Bradley watched tears stream down her face. The lawyer said the evidence is strong, she said quietly. He said Lloyd will probably take a plea deal. Good. I talked to Lloyd at the station. He swore he was innocent. Said you've been setting him up for years. Bradley said nothing. But then I listened to the recording, the one from Ethan's device. Her voice broke. I heard what he said to our son. The things he... She couldn't finish. Leona, I should have listened to you. She turned to face him. Her expression shattered. 3 years ago, when you first said something was off about Lloyd, I should have listened. But he's my baby brother. We grew up together. Our parents died when I was 22 and he was 16 and I raised him. I couldn't see it. We see what we want to see. No. Her voice turned sharp. No, Bradley. I saw the signs. I just chose to ignore them because it was easier than believing my brother could be a monster, and I chose him over you. Over Ethan. She wiped her eyes. I'm so sorry. It's Ethan you need to apologize to. I know. She looked at their son again. The firm is putting me on leave. The scandal, having a partner whose brother is arrested for child abuse. They want distance. I'm sorry. Don't be. I deserve worse. She moved toward the door, then paused. I'm staying at a hotel tonight. I need time to process everything. But Bradley, whatever happens with us, I need you to know I'm on Ethan's side now. I'll testify against Lloyd if needed. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. After she left, Bradley sat in the dark, watching his son sleep. Tomorrow would bring the arraignment, the formal beginning of the legal process. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he could breathe. He protected his son. The monster had been caught, and whatever happened next, Bradley would be ready. The courthouse was packed. News of Lloyd Keeley's arrest had spread through Sterling Heights like wildfire, and the local media had descended with cameras and microphones. Bradley held Ethan's hand as they navigated through the crowd, ignoring the shouted questions. Inside, the courtroom felt oppressively formal. Lloyd sat at the defense table with Devin McGowan dressed in an orange jumpsuit that seemed to drain the confidence from his features. When he saw Bradley, something dark flickered across his face before he looked away. Judge Marion Kemp presided, a stern woman in her 60s known for her no-nonsense approach to criminal cases. She reviewed the charges with clinical precision. Mr. Keeley, you are charged with attempted sexual assault of a minor, child endangerment, and unlawful restraint. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor. Lloyd's voice was steady, but Bradley could see the tremor in his hands. Devin McGowan stood. Your Honor, my client maintains his complete innocence. This case stems from a family dispute and a misinterpretation of innocent actions by Mr. Keeley's brother-in-law, who has a documented history of hostility toward my client. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jacqueline Silva, immediately objected. Your Honor, the defendant was caught in the act by a trained forensic psychologist. We have voice recordings of the defendant attempting to coerce the victim, medical evidence of inappropriate contact, and testimony from the minor victim detailing a pattern of abuse spanning over a year. Judge Kemp held up a hand. I've reviewed the evidence package. Mr. McGowan, your client's bail hearing will take into account the serious nature of these charges, the documented evidence, and the defendant's lack of stable employment or ties to the community. My client has strong family ties. Family ties that include the victim and the victim's family, the judge interrupted. I'm denying bail. Mr. Keeley will remain in custody pending trial. Lloyd's composure cracked. This is garbage. You're letting him destroy my life. The bailiff moved forward and McGowan put a restraining hand on Lloyd's shoulder. Your Honor, I request a moment with my client. Denied. Remove him. As Lloyd was led away, he turned to stare at Bradley with pure hatred. This isn't over. You self-righteous jerk. I'll prove you set me up. Bradley met his gaze steadily and said nothing. The truth needed no defense. Outside the courthouse, Jacqueline Silva approached Bradley. Mr. Connor, I need you to know that this case is solid. The evidence you provided, the recording device, your documentation, it's exactly what we need to ensure conviction. What about other victims? Bradley asked. Lloyd worked at several places with access to children. There could be more. We're investigating. If you have information on his previous employment, that would help. Bradley handed her a flash drive. Everything I compiled is on there. Contact information for former supervisors, dates of employment, the circumstances under which he left each position. Silva looked impressed. You're very thorough. I'm a father who knew his child was in danger and couldn't get anyone to listen. That afternoon, Bradley's phone started ringing. First was Doug Palmer, a colleague from work who'd heard about the arrest. Then Pete Wheeler, a neighbor who wanted to express support. Then Henry Lawrence, Ethan's teacher, calling to check on the boy. But mixed with the support were other calls, less friendly ones. A woman who identified herself as Norma Dugan, one of Leona's cousins, accused Bradley of destroying the family. A man named Gilberto Hahn, Lloyd's former roommate, claimed Bradley had always had it out for Lloyd because of jealousy. Bradley ignored them all and focused on Ethan. His son had been quiet since the arraignment, processing what he'd witnessed. "Dad, will Uncle Lloyd go to jail forever?" "For a long time, buddy. Long enough that he can't hurt you again." "What about Mom?" That was the harder question. Leona had texted that morning asking if she could see Ethan. Bradley had put her off, saying they needed more time. "Your mom loves you very much. She just needs to figure some things out." 2 days later, Rick Wood arrived with a briefcase full of analyzed documents. He spread them across Bradley's dining room table. Psychological profiles, pattern analyses, risk assessments. "Your documentation is extraordinary," Rick said. "You've essentially built a criminal profile of Lloyd over 3 years. Any prosecutor would kill to have this kind of detailed observation." "I needed to be sure. I needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed." "You've got it. But Bradley, there's something else." Rick pulled out another file. "I did some digging into Lloyd's background. Before he moved to Sterling Heights 10 years ago, he lived in 3 other states. I found sealed juvenile records in Pennsylvania, complaints filed with the police in Ohio that never went anywhere, and a restraining order in Maryland filed by a neighbor whose son was the same age as Ethan is now." Bradley felt his blood run cold. "So, this isn't his first time?" "Not even close. He's been doing this for years, maybe decades. He just got better at hiding it." "Does the prosecutor know?" "I'm sending everything to Silva today. This establishes a clear pattern. Combined with what happened at the funeral, Lloyd's going away for a very long time." That night, Bradley's doorbell rang. He found Leona on his porch looking smaller somehow than he remembered. "Can we talk?" she asked. He let her in. She looked around the house like she was seeing it for the first time, noticing things. Ethan's drawings on the refrigerator, the security system Bradley had installed, the way he'd rearranged the furniture to eliminate blind spots. "You changed everything," she said. "I made our home safe." She nodded slowly. "I've been meeting with a therapist, Dr. Ruth Hicks. She specializes in family trauma. She's helping me understand how I failed Ethan." "Good. I'm also meeting with Prosecutor Silva. I'm going to testify against Lloyd. Everything I know, every time I ignored a warning sign. Every time I chose to believe him over you, I'm going to tell it all in court." Bradley studied her. The woman standing in his living room was not the same person who'd screamed at him in the cemetery. Something fundamental had shifted. "Why the change?" he asked. "I listened to all the recordings. Not just the one from the funeral, but the ones you made over the years when you caught Lloyd saying inappropriate things to Ethan. The ones I refused to hear before." Tears streamed down her face. "I heard my own voice in some of them telling you to stop being paranoid, defending Lloyd, even when you were trying to show me evidence. I was complicit, Bradley. I helped him get access to our son." "Leona. No, I need to say this. I need to acknowledge what I did. My brother is a monster. And I enabled him because I was too weak to face the truth." She looked toward the stairs where Ethan was sleeping. "How is he?" "Scared, confused, angry, all of it at once." "Can I see him?" "Not yet. He needs more time." She nodded, accepting it. "I'm filing for divorce. I don't expect you to fight me on custody. I know I don't deserve it. I'll sign whatever agreement puts Ethan's safety first." Bradley hadn't expected that. "We can talk about it after the trial. There's something else you should know." She pulled out her phone, showing him a series of text messages. "Lloyd's been trying to contact me from jail. He's claiming you've been planning this for years, that you somehow orchestrated everything to frame him. He says he has proof." He's desperate. I know, but Bradley, he's always been persuasive. Even now, even after everything, there's a part of me that wants to believe him because it would be easier than accepting what he really is. She looked at him directly. Promise me you'll be careful. Lloyd is dangerous and he's got nothing left to lose. After she left, Bradley stood at the window, watching her car disappear down the street. Rick's words echoed in his mind. Lloyd had been doing this for years, getting away with it in multiple states, and now he was cornered. Bradley went upstairs and checked on Ethan, then returned to his office. He pulled out his journal and began to write, documenting everything that had happened since the funeral. Every conversation, every piece of evidence, every witness statement. Because Lloyd was right about one thing. This wasn't over. But Bradley had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. He'd studied predators his entire career. He knew how they thought, how they operated, how they tried to manipulate their way out of consequences, and he'd made darn sure there would be no escape this time. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Barber. We've identified 3 potential additional victims from Lloyd's past. Silva wants to meet with you tomorrow to discuss expanding the case. Bradley typed back, I'll be there. He looked at the evidence spread across his desk, the recordings, the medical reports, the testimony from Ethan, the pattern analysis from Rick, the historical complaints from other states. It was an overwhelming mountain of proof. But in his gut, Bradley knew Lloyd would try something. Desperate men were dangerous, and Lloyd had always been clever. So Bradley would stay vigilant. He would protect his son and he would make sure that when this ended, Lloyd Keeley would never hurt another child again. The war wasn't over. But Bradley had won the first battle and he intended to win them all. The trial was set for 6 weeks out. Bradley spent that time reinforcing every defense he could think of. He installed cameras outside the house. He varied his routes to work. He kept Ethan close and taught him more about safety. 3 weeks before the trial, something unexpected happened. A woman named Diana Beck contacted Detective Barber, saying she had information about Lloyd Keeley. She'd been a teacher at a school where Lloyd had volunteered 15 years ago, and she'd filed a complaint that had been ignored by administration. He was always hanging around the younger boys, she told Bradley when they met at the police station, always finding excuses to be in the locker room or the bathroom. I reported it to the principal, but Lloyd was charming. He convinced everyone I was bitter because he'd turned down my romantic advances. She laughed bitterly. I was married with 3 kids. I had no interest in him. But that's how he operates. He lies. He manipulates. And he gets away with it. Not this time, Bradley said. Good, because there was a boy, Matthew Ingram was his name. 8 years old. Sweet kid. After Lloyd left the school, Matthew changed. Started having behavioral problems, nightmares. His mother pulled him out mid-year. I always wondered if Lloyd had done something to him. Do you know where the family is now? I have contact information. I'll pass it to the detective. By the time the trial date arrived, Prosecutor Silva had assembled testimony from 4 previous victims spanning 15 years. Lloyd's pattern of predation was undeniable. The night before opening statements, Bradley sat with Ethan in their living room. Tomorrow starts the trial, he said gently. You'll have to testify. I'll be right there in the courtroom. So, will Detective Barber and Miss Silva. You just have to tell the truth about what happened. Will Uncle Lloyd be there? Yes, but he can't hurt you. There will be guards, and I'll be close by. Ethan nodded, trying to be brave. Dad, why did Uncle Lloyd do those things to me? It was the question Bradley had been dreading. How did you explain evil to a 9-year-old? Because he's sick, buddy. Not sick like a cold, but sick in his mind. He hurts kids because it makes him feel powerful and he doesn't care that it's wrong. But that's not your fault. None of this is your fault. I know you told me that. I'm telling you again because I need you to really believe it. They sat together in silence, father and son, preparing for the battle ahead. Outside, the sun set over Sterling Heights, casting long shadows across the lawn. Tomorrow, the truth would be told in court, and Bradley would make sure every word of it was heard. The morning of the trial dawned cold and clear. Bradley dressed Ethan carefully, choosing comfortable clothes that wouldn't distract him on the stand. As they drove to the courthouse, Bradley noticed the news vans already assembled outside. "It's going to be okay," he told his son. "Just remember, you're the bravest person I know." Ethan squeezed his hand. "Thanks, Dad." Inside the courtroom, Lloyd sat at the defense table, looking gaunt from his time in jail. When he saw Ethan, something predatory flashed in his eyes before his lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. Prosecutor Silva approached Bradley. "The defense is going to try to paint you as a vindictive spouse who coached your son. Be prepared for that." "I've been prepared for 3 years." The jury filed in, 12 citizens of Sterling Heights who would decide Lloyd's fate. Judge Kemp called the court to order. "This is the trial of the state versus Lloyd Keeley. Miss Silva, your opening statement." Jacqueline Silva stood commanding the courtroom's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a predator who used family connections to access and abuse children. The evidence will show that Lloyd Keeley systematically groomed and assaulted his nephew, 9-year-old Ethan Connor, over the course of more than a year. We will present voice recordings of the defendant attempting to coerce the victim, medical evidence of assault, testimony from the victim himself, and testimony from other victims spanning 15 years. She paused, letting that sink in. "The defendant will claim this is a misunderstanding, a family feud blown out of proportion. But the evidence speaks for itself. Lloyd Keeley is a serial predator who has hurt children across multiple states for decades. And it stops here today in this courtroom." Devin McGowan's opening was predictable. He painted Bradley as obsessed and controlling. Claimed the evidence was circumstantial, suggested that Ethan had been coached. But Bradley could see the jury's skepticism. They'd heard about the recordings, the medical evidence. They weren't buying it. The first witnesses were the responding officers from the funeral describing the scene they'd found. Then Detective Barber walking through the investigation. Then Karen Morse, the child forensic interviewer, explaining Ethan's disclosure. The sane nurse testified about her findings. Her voice clinical, but her eyes angry. The physical evidence was consistent with inappropriate sexual contact. There were marks on the child's body that could only have been made by adult hands. When Ethan took the stand, Bradley's heart nearly stopped. His small son looked so vulnerable in the witness box. But when Prosecutor Silva began asking questions, Ethan's voice was clear and steady. "What happened at your great-grandmother's funeral?" Silva asked gently. "Uncle Lloyd said he wanted to show me something special," Ethan said. "He took me behind the church to the old cemetery. I didn't want to go, but he said it was a secret." "What happened in the cemetery?" Ethan's voice wavered, but didn't break. "He started unbuttoning my shirt. He said he was going to give me something, but it felt wrong. I told him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. Then my dad came and called the police." "Had your uncle done things like this before?" "Yes. Lots of times when we were alone, he would touch me in places that made me feel bad, and he said, if I told anyone, it would make my mom sad." The defense's cross-examination was brutal. McGowan tried to suggest that Bradley had coached Ethan, that the boy was confused, that normal family affection had been misinterpreted, but Ethan held firm. "My dad gave me a recording device," Ethan said. "He told me it was for if I ever felt unsafe. I pressed it when Uncle Lloyd took me to the cemetery because I felt scared. And isn't it convenient that your father, who allegedly suspected your uncle of abuse, just happened to have given you this recording device?" "Objection," Silva said. Argumentative. Sustained, but the damage was done. The jury had heard the insinuation. Bradley watched McGowan work, saw the strategy, plant seeds of doubt, suggest elaborate conspiracy, make the truth seem too convenient to be real. Then came Bradley's turn on the stand. McGowan came at him hard. "Mr. Connor, you're a forensic psychologist, correct?" "Yes." "You specialize in criminal behavior analysis." "That's correct." "So, you would know exactly how to fabricate evidence of abuse, wouldn't you?" Objection. Silva was on her feet. Withdrawn. McGowan smiled. "Mr. Connor, you kept detailed notes about my client for 3 years. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Some might call that obsessive. I call it protecting my son. Or perhaps you had another motive." Perhaps you resented your wife's close relationship with her brother. Perhaps you wanted to drive a wedge between them. Bradley kept his voice level. I documented concerning behaviors because I'm a trained professional who recognizes predatory patterns. Everything I observed is consistent with grooming behavior. I gave my son a recording device because I knew Lloyd was dangerous and I needed proof that would stand up in court. How convenient that you had this proof ready. It's not convenient. It's preparation. Bradley leaned forward. I spent 3 years watching a predator circle my son, trying to warn people who wouldn't listen, knowing that if I was wrong, I'd be labeled paranoid, but knowing that if I was right and did nothing, my son would be hurt. So, yes, I prepared. I documented. I gave my son a way to protect himself. And thank God I did, because it stopped your client from assaulting a 9-year-old boy in a cemetery. The courtroom erupted. Judge Kemp banged her gavel. McGowan objected, but the words were out there hanging in the air. When order was restored, Silva called her next witness, Matthew Ingram, now 23, who testified about what Lloyd had done to him 15 years ago. Then Brett Gross, age 19, with a similar story. Then Donald Tuttle, age 27, the boy from Maryland whose mother had filed the restraining order. Each testimony was more damning than the last. Lloyd had left a trail of victims, and now they were all here, ready to speak their truth. The final piece of evidence was the recording from Ethan's device. The courtroom fell silent as Lloyd's voice filled the space. Just let me unbutton your shirt, champ. Don't be difficult. I'm trying to give you something nice. No, stop. I want to go back. Don't you want to be a good boy? When it ended, several jurors were wiping their eyes. Lloyd sat with his head down, finally broken. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood. We find the defendant guilty on all counts. Lloyd's face crumpled. He turned to look at Bradley one last time, and Bradley stared back without sympathy or satisfaction, just cold justice. At sentencing 2 weeks later, Judge Kemp was merciless. Mr. Keeley, you are a danger to children and society. You have shown no remorse, no understanding of the harm you've caused. I hereby sentence you to 40 years in prison without possibility of parole. Lloyd was led away, and this time there were no protests, no last words, just the sound of chains and the closing of a door. Outside the courthouse, Bradley held Ethan close as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Mr. Connor, how do you feel about the verdict? He looked directly into the cameras. I feel relieved that a dangerous predator has been removed from society. I feel grateful for everyone who helped bring him to justice, and I feel proud of my son, who is braver than any child should have to be. Jacqueline Silva joined them. You should know there are already inquiries from other jurisdictions. Lloyd's conviction is opening doors for other victims to come forward. You may have saved more children than you know. That night, Bradley and Ethan sat in their living room, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting. Is it over, Dad? The trial is over. Lloyd's going to prison for the rest of his life. What about Mom? That was the harder question. Leona had testified for the prosecution, her voice breaking as she admitted how she'd enabled Lloyd's access to Ethan. But she'd also filed for divorce, acknowledging she'd chosen her brother over her son when it mattered most. Your mom loves you. Bradley said, she made mistakes, but she's trying to make them right. We'll figure out how to move forward, all of us. A week later, Bradley sat across from Leona in a mediator's office, working out custody arrangements. She'd agreed to supervised visitation until Ethan felt comfortable, had committed to ongoing therapy, had cut ties with anyone who'd supported Lloyd. I know I can't fix what I did, she said quietly. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be the mother Ethan deserves. He needs his mother, but he needs a mother who will protect him. I will. I swear it. They signed the papers. Joint custody with Ethan primarily living with Bradley. Leona would have weekends once Ethan was ready. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. That night, Bradley read Ethan a bedtime story. Something they hadn't done in months. When he finished, Ethan looked up at him. Dad, you knew Uncle Lloyd was bad all along, didn't you? I suspected. I couldn't prove it until the funeral. You were protecting me the whole time. That's my job, buddy. Protecting you is the most important thing I'll ever do." Ethan hugged him tight. "Thank you." As Bradley turned out the light and closed the door, he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. The monster was locked away. His son was safe. And while the scars would take time to heal, they would heal. In his office, Bradley closed the leather journal for the last time. 3 years of observations, 3 years of preparation, all leading to this moment. He'd done what he set out to do, protect his child and ensure a predator faced justice. His phone buzzed with a text from Rick Wood. "Proud of you, man. You did the impossible." Bradley smiled. It hadn't been impossible. It had just required patience, preparation, and the absolute certainty that he would never let anyone hurt his son. He looked at the photo on his desk. Him and Ethan at the park last summer, both laughing, both free. That's what he'd fought for. That's what he'd won. And in the end, that was all that mattered.